All right, so let's talk about Ukraine for a minute and this story that's really only been covered in the independent media, minus an article by Time Magazine where they did a big investigation on this, and then a few other reports here and there. But this at Newsweek, a year after one sits, Ukraine's war draws U.S. far right to fight Russia, train for violence at home. And what this article is going into is it's what we talked about for a long time. There are militias in Ukraine that are straight up neo-Nazis to, whatever vaguely you want to call like far-right extremist groups, white nationalists, white supremacist type groups. And the most notable among them would be the Azov battalion that, again, on this show we've been talking about for years. And actually, I could say that if you go back and listen to episodes of Foreign Policy Focus in 2018, you could hear me saying that, one of the real risks to us backing the Ukrainian government and these Ukrainian militias is that just like what happened in the Middle East, you're going to have Americans go over there, train with these groups, become more radicalized, and then now they're able to travel back to the West or other places around the world and carry out horrendous crimes. And so we'll get into how all that happened here. But basically, there's a journalist that went over to, I think a National Geographic journalist actually went over to Ukraine and met with some members of these groups and kind of looked into the phenomenon that was going on here. And very interesting. She said, or I guess here's, I think, one of the more substantial paragraphs, asked if she had identified a trend in which U.S. extremists were joining counterparts in Ukraine to obtain battlefield experience. Van Zeller told Newsweek, yes, this is very much what we found in our investigation. So yeah, she's laying out, we interviewed members of a white supremacy group called the Atomwaffen Division. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It's probably supposed to sound more German, who have sent members to train in Ukraine, where neo-Nazi militias have recruited white supremacists from around the world in order to join their fight against Russia's and advanced racist ideology. And so, this is all done under the pretext of fighting against Russia. And all these white nationalists that we're talking about are on the same side of the war as the United States is, right? That these militias have actually been co-opted, including the Azov battalion, and made official members of the Ukrainian military, and the U.S. is arming the Ukrainian military. I mean, this has been such a problem that there's been at least 2 times where Congress, one time they just sent a letter, but it was 40 congressmen. So it's not just like Thomas Massie and Barbara Lee or something like that. There's a significant number of congressmen sending letters saying like, hey, what's going on? Are we looking into this? Maybe we should label the Azov battalion a terrorist organization. And then also in the 2018 NDAA, I don't think it actually made it into the final bill, but there was parts of that, and I'm pretty sure this was Tulsi Gabbard's like Stop Army Nazis Act, where she was really trying to push some kind of law that would prevent this from happening, the U.S. arming a military with white nationalist elements. Now, this isn't in the article, but it is something I read and did confirm this week, that in mid to late December, the Florida National Guard sent about 100 members to train near the separatist region of eastern Ukraine, which is where, at least in part, that this Azov battalion and now as a part of the National Guard is operating in Ukraine. And we also know that there are things like the prison system in Florida has like a white nationalist problem. There's white nationalist people within the Florida prison guard community and things like that. And so, you have to imagine that the Florida National Guard probably recruits from a somewhat similar community as the Florida prison guard system. And so you really have to worry about what kind of influence our National Guard troops are coming over, being deployed with these guys, these horrific people overseas. Also, this also isn't in the article, but something worth mentioning, and this is in the reporting of Mats Blumenthal at the Gray Zone about this figure Andre Perubi, who's a fairly recognizable and high-ranking figure within the Ukrainian politics, and at one time was actually Speaker of the Parliament. This is the side of the war that the U.S. is backing. This is the government that came to power after the U.S. coup. Right? This wasn't the government that, the U.S. was overthrowing in Ukraine. This was the government that the U.S. was backing in Ukraine. And the reason that this is so significant to like what's happening between Russia and Ukraine now is the reason that the U.S. is backing this side is it's because the most fiercely anti-Russian side, right? And so this is all about making sure there's a government in Ukraine that's favorable to the United States, and to the degree so that they would be willing to join NATO and continue to buy boatloads of U.S. weapons. I think more nefariously, there are people within the U.S. deep state who understand that this is a pressure point for Russia, and that Russia is going to do things like move troops into the region with Ukraine. Now, I still would put a huge asterisk on this 100,000 troop number, especially since they've been using the same number before and after Christmas when Russia announced, and no opposition, or nobody is disputed, that Russia did move 10,000 troops. And so you would think that number should at least come to 90,000, in most of the reporting, but it doesn't. They just keep it at 100,000, right? And so this is all very, very important here, that the U.S. is backing these elements in Ukraine, and that's all about the geopolitics of creating a low simmering tension with Russia to continue to weapon sales and have a need for NATO for years and years to come. I think that's part of the reason why when the U.S. was willing to think about the proposal that Putin put forward, it was the NATO head John Stoltenberg that came out immediately and was denouncing it as a non-starter and everything like that. So in this article, they have this statement that they got from the State Department, right? So, they're asking questions about supporting these elements in Ukraine and everything like that. And the State Department doesn't say give their boilerplate response to, we're committed to fighting extremism around the globe and even within the ranks of blah, 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 right? Nothing like that. They say the United States is committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity in the face of unprovoked Russian aggression. And so this statement absolutely confirms what I was just talking about, that the United States government, through administrations that included Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden, are more than willing to back white nationalists, neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine, even understanding the risk. And we'll talk about it in a second to get into what the risk is, that there are going to be white nationalist elements, people in the United States who go and train, become more radicalized, more familiar with weapons and battlefield tactics in Ukraine, and then potentially travel back to the United States. And so there's actually a couple examples of this. The New Zealand Christ Church shooter, who, this is the person whose manifesto was heavily redacted online and everything like that. And I believe he filmed himself killing dozens of people. And I think it was on Facebook Live. A very disturbing story. He had gone to Ukraine at least a couple of times and talked about that in his manifesto. We have this guy in the United States. I believe his last name is Lance. And he went to Ukraine and then came back to the United States, was robbing a house and killed 2 people. And so, this isn't necessarily the case of this guy, went to Ukraine, decided that he really, hated darker skinned people and came back and, hung to black men or something like that. I didn't exactly, wasn't clear what exactly happened in that case, but it seemed to be that it was primarily a burglary, but he resulted right to murdering. And so, I'm sure being around absolute neo-Nazi lunatics makes you more likely to be a killer of anyone. And, just when you're breaking into a home or something like that. By the way, this guy actually fled back to Ukraine after he did this. His name is Craig Lang, by the way. And I think actually is still in Ukraine and was potentially going to meet with Van Zeller, the interviewer for National Geographic, while they were making this documentary before declining to do so. But there's also been 6 other citizens that have been charged with their role of torturing separatists. So that would be, Russian-backed forces in the fight against Ukraine. And, these are the kind of elements that the U.S. is going to charge our, American citizens associated with war crimes and everything like that. But at the same time, we're going to continue to arm this force. It's absolutely unbelievable. So this is, I think, one of the more damning articles I've ever seen. They even have a picture here for people who are watching the video version. If you're not, it's the Ukrainian version of the Tiki Torch March. Essentially, they got a bunch of Azov guys marching through the streets with their torches and things like that. This is very disturbing stuff going on. The U.S. is backing all of it in the name of fighting Russia and combating Russia. And again, from the more nefarious elements, creating this guaranteed conflict between the U.S. and Russia to facilitate arms sales. Now I want to talk about what's going on in Kazakhstan. And this is one of those places where, we have reports now that after a week of unrest, the health officials say that 164 people have been killed. Those are government numbers. It vaguely accurate, maybe it's right on, maybe it's like a tenth of the actual people that were killed. Who actually knows? They also say that 5,800 people have been arrested. It seems very likely and has been reported that some of the dead are among security forces. And I did see reporting that, was a BBC journalist. So I would actually expect them to be more anti government, Kazakhstan government, and pro-protester that was showing that government buildings have been vandalized and arson burned down, that government vehicles have been burned. And so it did seem like there was quite a lot of violence on at least each side of this thing, and that, maybe protest isn't the best way to put it, and that this was like a full-on riot. Now, I've seen several different suggestions as far as what's going on here. They vary from U.S. color-coded revolution, no actual movement against the government in Kazakhstan that's not backed by the United States, to this had nothing to do with the United States and was all just a natural uprising to a authoritarian government. And of course, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There's a pretty good article by Moon of Alabama that I think makes the best case for the U.S. involved color-coded revolution. There are a lot of civil society groups in Kazakhstan that are backed by the United States, but at the same time, there are things happening in that country that do seem, like people living in poverty and like very, very deep poverty, and the government getting rich and contracts being decided by the government and certain groups being cut out. I won't go into too much detail about all that yet because I'm not exactly sure what's exactly happening, but it would not surprise me if a government was doing that. And so I'm sure there's a natural need, or not natural need, but there's a within Kazakhstan, without any foreign interference, there is a festering group of people who, from protests to militia, I don't know what it is, are, angry at the government and are willing to act on that anger, right? Again, I'm not sure how far they're willing to go or everything or like that, especially without U.S. help or influence, but I'm sure that exists in Kazakhstan, and it could have in part been what was acted on here. And I think that this, if we look at what's happened in like Iran in recent years, this is essentially what happens, right? When the government does something particularly bad, or, just the economy is really bad, and then the government has to make some tough choices, whichever way you want to put that. And I'm sure, there's a lot of corruption in Iran, and the elite of that country do very well, while other people live in a lot of poverty, and there's a lot of oppression and all that kind of stuff, right? But it's when protests start, it seems like the U.S. really attempts to capitalize on them, to fuel them, to make them as big as possible. And so I wonder if that's kind of what happened here in Kazakhstan, where the protests happened and then the U.S. civil society groups kicked into full gear to try to turn this into a bigger deal. Now, there's also one other possibility I just want to mention, and some people are pointing this out, and that it could have been a essentially not like false flag by Russia, but a move by Russia to create instability in Kazakhstan to get more influence within that country, because through the I think it's the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO. It's not the Warsaw Pact, but it is Russia's kind of alliance with some former Soviet states, including Kazakhstan, send troops to that country. And it, it could have been the country's leader, looking to have, maybe seeing the Russian troops as potentially absolute security force, right? And so once you had those troops there, you can't be overthrown. So he generates this. And then the one other thing I saw is that maybe this is outside of the United States, but really not necessarily a popular uprising either, and has more to do with different factions in Kazakhstan. So this is basically, the Republican and the Democratic leadership duking it out, and not necessarily being generated by desires and needs for the people, but from themselves, but rather them being either radicalized or, bribed to by the leadership of that country to, try to make a power play for the leadership. Of course, the U.S. condemned what Russia was doing in Kazakhstan, and I think Antony Blinken gave like a warning, saying something along the lines of, once you get these Russian troops in your country, it's really hard to get them to leave, which is hilarious, since Iraq can still get the U.S. troops to leave 20 years later, and Pakistan still has drones flying over their country from the United States. So just a lot of interesting things from the U.S. comments and all that, and I'm sure I'll report more on Kazakhstan as I learn a little bit more. But I am pretty skeptical of the color-coded revolution narrative, at least to be seen. And again, if you want the best narrative on that so far I've read, it is at the Move of Alabama website. The U.S. is deploying 200 National Guard soldiers from Kentucky to Kosovo. This is, a part of the UN, I believe, or maybe just NATO mission to that country, resulting from, the conflict there in the 1990s. And I don't know a lot about it, but, one of the reasons I want to point this out is a lot of states are using their National Guard for various kinds of COVID relief. And here we are sending our National Guard around the world to play geopolitics and everything like that. Just kind of makes me think that the U.S. government is as serious about COVID as they claim to be sometimes. This from Reuters: U.S. to open special operation forces base in Albania. And I feel like it kind of suggests in this article that this base will remain and stay in that case, but it does say on a rotational basis. And so I'm not sure if maybe it will only be the headquarters on a rotational basis and exist all the time, or if the base will actually only exist itself for a select period of time. But that is more U.S. forces going to be in Europe. The U.S. also sanctioned a Bosnian Serb leader over corruption charges. I'm not sure what the geopolitics or all this are and why this person is being sanctioned and not somebody else in Bosnia, but just, again, something I want to mention. And we'll end the Russia segment on a little bit of good news, and that is the U.S., Russia, and China say a nuclear war must never be fought because, there are no winners in a nuclear war. And so it's absolutely great that this statement comes out, but unfortunately, none of these states are really doing anything, and particularly the U.S. being the worst among them, to reduce the number of nuclear weapons or the likelihood that they're going to be used.